Think Less, See More podcast, episode 5. This is part 2 on Buddhism. In part 1, we spoke about the first 3 of the 4 noble truths, with the first one being a noble truth of suffering, dukkha. And the Buddha saw this sense of dissatisfaction, of not being completely at peace in the present moment. He saw it in himself, and he saw it in others too. And he also saw that this suffering was inextricably linked to the nature of his body and mind, obviously. He contemplated, meditated, developed an awareness of the activities of his body and mind in order to look deeply into the nature of this suffering, seeing how it arose in himself. And with this awareness, by looking deeply, he saw the second noble truth, which is that the most tangible root cause of this suffering is desire, thirst. This desire for something to exist or not to exist. This desire for a pleasurable experience to continue or for a painful experience or sensation to end. This desire for something good that had happened to happen again, or this desire for something bad that had happened to not happen again. This desire for something to be true or not true, which is to believe in something or not to believe in something. The Buddha saw this thirst was at the root of his suffering and was interdependent with this mental volition, which is essentially this action orientated around the sphere of good and bad, essentially acting based on this desire, acting based on what you like or don't like, what you want or don't want, what you believe or don't believe. You see, there's this thirst, this desire, there's this action based on this desire, this thirst, these beliefs, these likes and don't likes, you see? So this desire, this thirst, and this desire and mental volition, action based on the sphere of what you believe and see to be good and bad, what you like and don't like, that constitutes this sense of self. And therefore there is this desire, this mental volition, and this sense of self, this separate entity who was the one who believed this, who believed that, the one who was attached to this outcome. You see what I mean? So the Buddha saw that this desire, this volition, and this sense of being a separate self was the most tangible root cause of his suffering. He saw that it caused him to suffer, as he would want something to turn out a certain way, and if it didn't, he would suffer. He would want a pleasurable sensation to remain, but it would fade away. And that division, that difference between the reality of what was happening and what he wanted to happen or believed was happening, that difference between the reality and the activity of the self was suffering, was causing and was the most tangible root cause of his suffering. Moreover, he saw how this mental volition, acting based on what, you believe, what I want, you see, how this action based on the self also caused others to suffer. Then one would act not based on what is true, but based on their desires, leading to greed, hatred, discrimination. I want more and more and more money, more and more power. I believe that I deserve these people's land because I want their resources, you see? And therefore, it doesn't matter where anyone was in the world, the root cause of their suffering was this sense of desire. And that is the second noble truth. The Buddha then saw that by having this clarity, that it was possible for this suffering to be uprooted. As he had seen the arising of this suffering, looked deeply into the nature of this suffering, seen what was at the center, and then would be able to uproot that center in seeing the arising of this suffering, the first noble truth, looking deeply into the center, the second noble truth. Then he saw the third noble truth, the cessation of that suffering. He saw this desire and this attachment to how things turned out was causing him to suffer. But in seeing all of this, he also saw how all of these feelings and even objects and people and, things in our world, he saw that everything was impermanent. It doesn't matter what it was, how much he wanted it to exist or not exist. He saw that all of these things would just arise and cease. And therefore, his mind could shift from becoming attached, wanting it to be like this, not wanting it to be like that, to realizing that he wasn't in control. And it didn't matter how much he wanted something or believed something, liked or disliked it. It was what it was. It sounds extremely simple, but by realizing, seeing this, seeing that everything would arise and cease, his mind could become detached, and he stopped trying to control and wanting and not wanting, and could just be completely aware of the reality of what was right now. And with that clarity, equanimity, there was no room for attachment or what he wanted or didn't want or any of that. All those activities of the self could fade away. And there was this pure equanimity in the present. And that arose from seeing how everything arose and just ceased. Everything would arise and cease, and therefore his mind could become detached, you see, not clinging to things as he knew everything was impermanent. And that allowed there to be freedom and detachment in place of desire and detachment by seeing the center and uprooting it. Moreover, a lot of these deep fears associated with being this separate self who could die and could end, those fears were also uprooted as the Buddha saw that as everything was impermanent and everything arose interdependently, existed in relation to everything around him, he also saw that this sense of being a separate self who was the one who was attached, the one who believed this, the one who believed that, he saw how that was just a notion, how that was just a mental formation, that in reality, as everything was impermanent, always changing, and existed in relationship to everything, how obviously this sense of being a separate self was illusory. And by becoming detached and free of this sense of being separate, he could be in the present, completely aware of the reality of what was happening with equanimity, feeling as a part of the world around him, connected, as opposed to this separate self he was trying to control and want and not want and desire and all the rest of it, you see. He could be connected, realize his interdependence with everything, and there could then be this true realization of oneness and therefore this natural compassion as he saw the reality of suffering, uprooted his suffering and understood what it was like and deeply felt that suffering. And therefore that and seeing his oneness with others, then there was compassion, not causing others to suffer, you see? And in all of that, there is then this uprooting of the suffering, this ending of this desire and attachment by being completely aware and having equanimity in the present, and therefore leaving no space for anything else, just this ending of the self and all of those volitional activities based on what you think and what you believe. All of his beliefs and attachment to them faded away. There could still be these thoughts and ideas that could help him understand and communicate and think, oh, this might be nice. But if he didn't get it, he was detached. It was fine. He still cared, had compassion, but realized that things were just going to go how they were going to go. It's very simple, but by realizing it himself, there was freedom. And this same principle of seeing the arising of suffering, seeing what was at the root cause, and then uprooting that root cause, leading to the cessation of that suffering, that's very big. But what we can do is apply that same principle to our own daily lives. We may feel jealous, for example, and normally what we might do is feel jealous about something, blah, 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 and either act on it, be rude to someone, or try and escape from it. You see, try and escape from it into the television or drugs and alcohol or food or whatever. But if we look at this basic principle, what we can now do is take responsibility for that jealousy. We can firstly acknowledge it, the first noble truth, see that there is that jealousy. Second, spend time contemplating, looking deeply into the nature of that jealousy. Then we can see, wait, what's the root cause of this jealousy? And we can see actually the root cause of this jealousy is my own insecurity, you see? And then in seeing our own insecurity, we can then face our own insecurities and uproot that jealousy, leading to the third noble truth, the cessation of that jealousy. You see, that's how we're linking these kind of principles of Buddhism to our daily life. We don't have to start with the whole of suffering like the Buddha, but we can start bit by bit, understanding our jealousy, our anger, and beginning to uproot these problems we have in our lives from the center instead of running away. And now, after kind of going over and providing all of that in one little piece, we're going to now add on the fourth noble truth, which is essentially the eightfold path that the Buddha, you know, lined out, spoke about, which is essentially the actions and ways of living and things that you can do that align with the sorts of insights you have when he saw the true nature of things, the nature of this suffering and how there could be freedom from this suffering. There are ways that he and people can act that are in accordance with those realizations and also set you up to be in the best place to, have those realizations. And so the first three parts of this noble eightfold path are the parts which constitute ethical living, which is essentially being aware of how you live and operate. So we have right speech, right action, and right livelihood. So to begin with, we can apply those same principles from the first three noble truths, which is that with right speech, we can firstly become aware of how we speak. We can become aware that sometimes you may speak in such a way that causes harm to people. And by being aware of that, we can then think and look and contemplate and see what is at the center of that. Why are we speaking in hurtful ways to these people? And then we can begin to speak in ways that have kindness, compassion, ways that make people feel better and alleviates their suffering instead of causing suffering. It's very simple, but you see how what we're doing is we're taking responsibility, becoming aware of how we speak, caring about how we speak, and changing the way that we operate so that we can cause less suffering for others because we've understood and faced and really seen what that suffering is actually like in ourselves. So there's right speech, speaking in ways that are kind. And then we have right action, which is very similar. We may act in ways that cause people pain. And very simply, we can see and become aware and face the reality that we're doing that, see why we're doing that, and then begin to act in ways that bring happiness to people and joy to people. It's very simple, but the more we do this, the better our lives and the lives of others will get. And then we have right livelihood, which is essentially having a job that doesn't directly lead to the suffering of people. For example, not working for an arms company and creating weapons that are used to kill people. Really simple. So that's ethical living. Living in such a way that is in alignment with these kind of realizations of the way things really are. You know what I mean? The reality that a lot of the time the way we act and speak and live is causing suffering to people, and we should probably change that. It's simple, but we tend to avoid these simple realities as our minds are overwhelmed with our jobs and this and that and what we've got to do and what we want and believe and like and dislike. You see what I mean? And then we have the next part, which is, like I spoke about in previous episodes, in order to have these insights, to really take responsibility for your mental health and to really transform and change, you need a sense of mental discipline. And this involves another three parts, which is right effort. Essentially realizing that, wait a minute, I actually do want to do something. This will to change. That's the first one, right effort. Then the Buddha spoke about right mindfulness, which is, like I said, you firstly develop that kind of effort and focus on the breath and this and that, and then you develop that right mindfulness, which is this awareness of the activities of your body and mind, like how you're acting, how you're thinking, how you're speaking. Be aware of that, you see? That's this right mindfulness, this open awareness. And that right mindfulness is then what allows us to live ethically and have these kind of insights and understanding by being aware of how we think, feel, act, and speak in the present moment. Then we also have right concentration, which is, like I said, when we first begin, we get that focus on the breath and that tranquility and one-pointed awareness, which then can lead to this kind of open, pure awareness and equanimity, you see, which then allows us to have right mindfulness and be aware of what's going on. You see how these kind of all these different parts of the Eightfold Path are really interdependent. Right mindfulness allows us to have right speech and right action, and it's supported by right concentration and right effort, you see. It's basically the Buddha outlining these things that we can do and ways that we can live that are in accordance with these realizations of what's real and what's true. And then we have the last two parts of the Eightfold Path, which is right thought and right understanding. Right thought is essentially to begin to shift away from this kind of rigid sense of self, only focused on what I want and I believe, thinking about myself, to having more thoughts of others, being more selfless. As that rigid sense of self begins to fade away, we can have more thoughts of selflessness and non-violence. And then the final step or part of the path is the part of right understanding, which is essentially seeing things as they are. So, like how I spoke about in previous episodes, letting go of our beliefs and preconceptions and notions and ideas and seeing things how they actually are, perceiving the reality of what's going on in the present moment, having equanimity and clarity as we are free from believing and thinking that all these thoughts and ideas that we have are what's happening, and we're free from the illusion and distortion that is caused by wanting this, not wanting that, believing this, not believing that. You see, this activity of the self, which causes this illusion, this suffering. As that begins to fade away, there can then be this clarity, this right understanding, even though these, you know, these three noble truths and this eightfold path are laid out in an order, they're all kind of supporting each other and arising interdependently as we begin to care and begin to transform and change. And that is what the Buddha spoke about. He spoke about these four noble truths, which, when we apply it to our lives, is basically to become aware of ourselves, take responsibility for what's going on inside of ourselves and how we're acting in order to live in a way which alleviates suffering in ourselves and in others. And you see, the more people that do that, the better the world will be. It's a very simple principle, but we avoid this simplicity, as this simplicity means that we must all take responsibility, as many of us are happy just going along, living the way we live with our fleeting pleasures and, cars and whatever, all the rest of it. And other people are in such dire situations that don't even really have the time to really contemplate a lot of this stuff. But the people that do, and that do hear and understand this, need to take the responsibility to then take care of themselves, treat others better, and create an energy of positive change that will spread and that targets the root cause of the problem instead of messing around with a load of politics and electing different dickheads to run our country. But anyway, bit of a side note there. But to bring it back to the Buddhism, there's something that supports this understanding, this compassion, and is involved in this right understanding and right mindfulness is this Buddhist truth of anatman, or non-self, which I'm going to quickly expand upon here as this episode comes to a close, which is that in Buddhism, they reject the notion of there being this separate self, which is like how I spoke about before. There is no reality in this notion of being a separate permanent self who's behind all of this, as the Buddha saw that, like I said, everything is impermanent and arises and ceases. A good way to explain it is that a tree doesn't exist by itself. The tree is made of the soil, the air, the sun, the rain, and exists interdependently with them. The tree is made of non-tree elements. You see, it has no separate unchanging self. All of the cells, even the atoms within the tree, are always moving, flowing, changing, and it exists interdependently with the whole earth. And by understanding and seeing this, and seeing that this kind of separate self who is a British white man who is a Christian or, believes this or whatever, that this sense of being this concrete self, this is me, that is divisive, leads to division, and is actually completely illusory by nature. But when the activities of this self fade away, our attachment to what we want and don't want, believe and don't believe fades away, we then see the reality of our oneness. Oneness not as an abstraction or a personality trait or one with everything wishy-washy stuff, but as a reality of physics. Things exist in relativity, like I've said before. And by seeing that, we then move away from the discriminatory ways of the self and then move into the compassionate, loving ways of being connected with everything, seeing that we are one with everything, letting go and dropping that sense of being this separate self. Then there can be love. Then we can connect with each other. And the more people that do this let go of that and uproot this suffering and have clarity and equanimity, then we can begin to work together, not operate based on what we believe and don't believe. But when that's all out the window, two people can come together and see the same thing with clarity. the source of this illusion and desire and hatred has been uprooted, and therefore we can just see what's going on and act based on what's going on. It seems simple, but it is only with this change and then the love and sense of community and care that comes along with it, by realizing that this sense of being a separate self is illusory and letting go of all of our identifications, that we can then return to what is real. We can return to peace, compassion, clarity, and love. And that is really a beautiful thing. And that is why you should think less and see more. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll see you in episode 6.